Hello and a warm welcome to today's edition of Business Africa. I'm your host, Afolake Oinloye. The top stories this week. Cut between repaying debt and increasing revenue collection, developing countries turn to raising taxes. In Kenya, that has had deadly consequences. We assess how African countries can navigate economic pressures. Good news for South Africa. The country enjoys $1.1 billion trade surplus in May 2024 due to strong export growth and declining imports. Tanzania's fisheries sector booms with rise in export and improved infrastructure, but faces challenges from illegal fishing. The cancellation of Kenya's Finance Bill 2024 following anti-tax protests is forcing the government to adjust the budget and seek alternative income sources to prevent economic instability. The withdrawal of the bill also means that businesses will now have a reprieve from the taxes that they would have paid had the bill been signed into law.
Kenya's Finance Bill 2024 was to help the government collect additional taxes amounting to $2.7 billion in the country's budget of $31.19 billion. With the anti-tax protests forcing President William Ruto to send the bill back to Parliament to be withdrawn, some sections of the budget will have to be adjusted to enable the government operate.
The repercussions is that the development agenda that was to be achieved through that budget has either to be reduced or set aside altogether. It also means that the expenditure side, anything else that was supposed to be done on the expenditure, that is maybe if you are roads, if it were water, if it was infrastructure, or in terms of railways, ports, all those that were to be done within the next financial year would not be done.
To ensure that the country's economy doesn't collapse, the government will now find new ways to generate income to run their programs.
If you can't manage to raise taxes just because of the nature of what kind of taxes you would raise, and even the formal sector is contracting, then the best thing is actually to use user fees. That is why we are emphasizing, if the government cannot have adequate resources to generate the investment or services that you need, they can pass on to the private sector PPP approach, and people are ready to pay fees.
Though the government still maintains that the finance bill will have helped boost the government programs and also settle part of the national debt that now stands at $69.97 billion, tax experts have warned that uncertainty in tax policy discourages local and foreign investors from setting up or expanding business in the country.
Aly-Khan Satchu is a Kenyan-based economist. He joins us for more on that report. Welcome to the show. Now, how can developing countries in similar situation as Kenya navigate debt and increase revenue collection without necessarily enraging an already stressed population?
So, I mean, that's a $64,000 question. I think to contextualize Kenya in the context of the question, we had very large borrowing in the previous administration, of which the president was a part, but sort of semi-detached. So he inherited a very complicated situation, essentially went to the IMF, the World Bank for support. They gave him a great deal of support. And the quid pro quo in that case was these very sharp rises in taxes. And I think, what we're watching unfold in real time is a population saying, we've reached the limit. And I think it's that which has taken everyone by surprise, the response, the maturity of it, and the sophistication of it. But I think in Kenya's case, they've got to go back and renegotiate with the multilaterals and say, look, this level of pressure in the short term is much too high. You've got to mitigate it and maybe stretch out the repayments a little longer. But clearly, the administration has hit a brick wall.
Now, what immediate and long-term economic consequences can be expected after the cancellation of the tax bill?
So obviously, Kenya was in a very challenging fiscal position. It was spending far more than it was collecting. its debt was consuming 61% of revenues, which is just unbelievable when you think about it. A very challenging environment. So in the short term, I think, the numbers, instead of improving, are probably going to flatline from here in terms of fiscal deficit. And obviously, they're going to have to borrow more money if they're not able to collect it in taxes. And I think it's clear they're not going to be able to. What we've watched unfold is very revolutionary and very interesting, but it's a citizen pushing back highly effectively and pointing out the government needs to tighten its belt if it's asking others to tighten their belts. And I think that's something that's going to play out across the continent.
Now, what sustainable fiscal strategies can Kenya employ to reduce its budget deficit without causing public backlash?
I think, the key challenge and the elephant in the room, and the one that all African governments are failing to look at in the eye, is the cost of the government. The governments today cost way too much in terms of the consumption of total revenues. And we've got to look at ways to make government leaner, more efficient, and optimized for the 21st century. But when I look across the continent, I see the biggest problem is recurrent expenditure. And this is the cost of the government to deliver the services to the citizenry. And in every case, I think this is the real problem. And if you can make reductions, it's very unpopular, very difficult to do. But that's what I think the original sin is.
Mr. Satchu, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
South Africa achieved a trade surplus of 1.1 billion surplus in May 2024, driven by a significant increase in exports. The latest figures from the South African Revenue Service reveals a strong export performance and improved resilience for the country's economy.
South Africa recorded a trade surplus of $1.1 billion for May 2024, driven by a surge in exports and a decline in imports. The South African Revenue Service reported that exports totaled $9.9 billion, while imports were $8.7 billion. This is good news for the country, which recorded a budget deficit of $700 million in May. Month on month, exports rose by 9.6 billion rand, an increase of 5.7% from April to May 2024, boosted by iron ore, manganese, PGMs, citrus fruit and vehicles. Imports fell by 800 million rand, mainly due to reduced oil and wheat imports. From January to May 2024, the cumulative trade surplus reached $2.4 billion, up from $908 million in 2023, reflecting the resilience of South Africa's export sector. Trade with Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho and Namibia resulted in a surplus of 11.9 billion rand in May 2024, with exports at 17.1 billion rand and imports at 5.2 billion rand. Experts believe that a trade surplus can create employment and economic growth. May was election month in South Africa, and some level of political uncertainty was feared to have an effect on economic performance.
Tanzania's fish exports have surged by 41% in just 1 year, driven by increased production from aquaculture. The export worth over $200 million underscored the growth potential of aquaculture in the East African nation's economy. Isaac Lukando reports from Dar es Salaam.
Tanzania's fisheries sector is on an upward trajectory, with government reports showing export volumes rising from about 26,000 tons in 2023 to around 41,000 tons by April this year. The government says addressing inadequate post-harvest infrastructure and high post-harvest losses has been key to improving exports.
The government, in collaboration with development partners, has renovated existing fish processing infrastructure, including cold rooms, and has even bought fish drying equipment.
Exporters like Paul Buguse say change within the sector is tangible. According to the government, Tanzania's fisheries sector directly employs about 200,000 people. Additionally, around 10% of the country's 60 million people indirectly depend on fishing activities.
The government says last year, Tanzania's fisheries sector contributed approximately 1.8% to the country's GDP, a rather small figure compared to other sectors such as agriculture and mining. But with over 1,400 kilometers of coastline, it also notes that, given the right conditions, the sector has significant potential for growth.
With around 8,500 tons exported last year, seaweed has been an unlikely contributor to the growth in exports. Despite success in increasing exports, Tanzania's fisheries sector is still plagued by illegal fishing practices that are reducing catches. The government says it is implementing stricter regulations to curb these activities while seeking new international markets for fish products, hoping that the country's numerous water bodies can yield greater benefits for its citizens. Isaac Lukando, Africanews, Dar es Salaam.
And with that, we wrap up with this edition of Business Africa. Thank you for joining us. For more captivating business stories and news, stay tuned to Africa News and africanews.com.